Right, let's see, make sure, all right, we are live.
So, first things first, the highest grade on exam 2 was a 100. It wasn't mine. So, that's good. I'll be happy to go retest in office hours. So many things to talk about. We are getting booted out of 153B for the next 2 weeks. We're gonna move to 156. I'll email you guys. They're doing like dean interviews and they wanted to use this room. I mean, it'll just cost you like 50 more steps, so it's not a big deal. But the reason I think we can make it work is typically a fraction of the class actually comes to class, so I think we'll have enough seats. Not that they have to, or not that you have to, but that's why I think we can make it work. So 156 is where we're going to have class for the next 2 weeks. Guys, what's coming up the pipeline is the biomechanics of specific muscles, how they influence motion through contraction. 310, just with specific muscles. Everything I teach you has purpose. Everything I teach you answers a question. What is important to a majority of kinesiology majors? So where are my physical education, any physical education majors out there, our pre-professional people, all of you guys, athletic training, physical education, allied health professions, you are going to be dealing with people and movement, and what influences motion? Specific muscles, okay? So things like bony landmarks, or, sustentaculum pali, or Derby's tubercle, or my favorite, superior colliculate quadrangina, brain. Who cares? Who cares? That's geography. If I want to know the capital of Texas, I could just go look it up and it says Austin. That's not going to change. What's more important, and you may have classes that just make you memorize bony landmarks. That's great. A bony landmark isn't going to tell you how a muscle influences motion. In fact, incorrectly, too many times people will say, well, if you know the origin and the insertion of a muscle, then you know motion. No, that's not it either. Memorization isn't going to help us understand how muscles influence motion. I'm going to teach you what's going to help us understand how muscles influence motion. And a lot of that you've already had before. The 310 part, where we talked about external forces trying to do what, so you can see what kind of muscles you need in terms of a group of direction of pull. And all we're doing in this class is taking the next step. Who are the flexors and why are they the flexors? Who are the hip extensors and why are they the hip extensors? Who are the abductors and why are they the abductors? Who are the right transversal rotators and why are they the right transversal rotators? Okay. So what we're going to start off with is how many variables there are with some of this material and why for some people it gets overwhelming and complicated, and how I'm going to try to simplify. I'll try to simplify it. I'm not going to try to make it more complicated. I'm going to try to make it a lot less complicated. Okay. So look at something like this. You have all these muscles, and so you're doing reverse grip curls, and you got these muscles at the forearm, and you got these muscles. But you know what we know from 310? Those forearm muscles aren't doing anything other than maintaining the wrist position so that the dumbbell. Those forearm muscles, unless they cross the elbow, unless they function at the elbow, aren't making that dumbbell go up and down. You need elbow flexion pullers to make it go up and down. Anything else is just either preventing motion or stabilization, right? Okay? In addition, some of those muscles, man, look, some of them on the side, is that pulling this way, that way? Sometimes all these muscles, it's hard to kind of see how they're pulling because they're kind of all over the place. You ever see a picture of somebody with the skin off on part? There's muscles all over the place. Sometimes it's hard to, some of them easy, but some of them, well, is it not? It's kind of at an angle, where is it? I'm going to teach you how to simplify those kind of issues. So you have all these variables. How many muscles in the body? You know what the correct answer is? A lot. Because some of them deal with the eyes and some of them deal with the ears, and some of you are born without certain muscles. There's like a certain percentage of you that don't have a palmaris longus or plantaris. And so there really is no like specific right answer. A lot. You got a lot. How many different motions do we have? A lot. How many different contractions do we have? 3. But when you take in all those variables, a ton of muscles, a lot of joint motions, and 3 different contractions, there's a ton of different possibilities. And it's overwhelming. I'm going to make some sense of it. I'm going to try to help us funnel in all those options, simplify it, so that at the end of the day, we understand without a doubt how specific muscles are affecting specific motions through specific contractions. Remember in 310, we analyzed motion joint by joint. You could have some complex thing, and I was like, look, break it down. What is the ankle doing? What is the knee doing? What is the hip doing? Remember that? Very similar. When you're doing all these exercises, it's overwhelming. Muscles and joints and contractions. We're going to break it down. We analyze motion joint by joint. We're going to analyze muscles joint by joint. And I'm going to teach you how muscles influence motion through contraction. Notice every time I've said it, you've had 3 variables: muscles, motion, contraction. I never left out one or the other. And that is one of the problems with previous communication of this information, is that they leave out the context of contraction. It's a big problem. I'll give you an example. I'll give you several examples to prove my point. I went on Google and said, hey, Google, what does the biceps brachii do? And Google was like, it bends the forearm, flexion. Ooh, interesting. And it rotates it outward, supination. Thanks, Google. Is there any scenario where that's not true? In other words, if I say the bicep does flexion, can I have flexion and it not be the bicep? It's a tricep exercise, right? I could have flexion. In fact, later on, to kind of show this point, I kind of give some examples. All right. In addition, if this is all you've memorized or been told, you're looking for a specific motion. It's a pattern recognition. Ooh, when I see flexion, I memorize that it's got to be this muscle. Until it's not. Or how do you explain isometrics? Is there going to be any motion in isometrics? Can the bicep do something without motion? Yeah, how are you going to see that? If we just memorize, here's a muscle, here's a motion, here's a muscle, here's a motion, here's a muscle, here's a motion. In 3 seconds, I told you that there's exceptions to those rules. Now, you can say the bicep does flexion when it's working concentrically. No problem with that. But that's a fraction of the time. Do you see the problem? That we, and there's a reason for it, is because fitness isn't an allied health profession, and anybody can go get certified through Kellogg's Corn Flakes to do this. And so it's easy to just give memorizational concepts. What do the hamstrings do? Flex the knee. I'm flexing my knees right now. I'm not using my hamstrings and my knees. You see what I'm saying? So we have to have 3 variables here: muscles, motion, and contraction. We have to have the context of contraction when talking about how muscles influence motion. Is that fair? Okay. So I set up the problem. Now, hopefully, I'm going to help set up the solution. Okay. Warning, do not assume specific agonists with specific joint motions. What's an agonist? 310 review. What does that mean? What does an agonist mean? The specific muscles, what? Yeah, doing a job, right? That we're recruiting above rest to do the work, to do the job. True? An agonist is the specific muscles that are doing the work, that are doing the exercise, that are doing the job. My cervical extensors right now are agonists, preventing my head from flexing over. They're above. That's why at the end of the day, like your neck muscles might be tired and sore. They've been working all day doing the job. The opposite of an agonist is an antagonist, a muscle that we need to turn off or lesser, not doing the job. And remember, all of this stuff is above resting tone. The analogy I give for an agonist is your body is doing physiological work right now. You're burning energy, but the energy that you're burning is a baseline metabolic rate. Remember that from exercise physiology? So you're not exercising right now. You're burning energy. Your body's working, but it's working at baseline. You're not exercising. You would say exercising would be on top of that, right? What is your body doing on top of your resting metabolic? It's the same thing with that. Your muscles are always pulling. But pulling at rest is called resting tone. That's how much do they pull at rest. That doesn't mean they're an agonist. When they're being an agonist, that means they're pulling on top of resting tone. They're doing more than at rest. They're doing a job more than at rest. Make sense? So agonist, who's working? The agonistic group are the muscles responsible for doing a job. You're doing curls, your elbow flexion pullers would be the agonist, responsible for the motion. Right? Or in layman's terms, you're doing curls, you need your bicep and all of the biceps buddies. You wouldn't need the tricep for that exercise. So in this case, the tricep would be the antagonist. Agonist doing the job, antagonist. Agonist doing the job, antagonist. Simple enough. So every time you hear agonist, you need to think the muscles that are doing a job. All right. So here is a more detailed issue with the concept of muscle action. And I've actually seen a lot more books, resources, people change action, which I'm all for, into what I like to use called function purpose. You remember in our unit one of my issues, it's not just me, several people in physics with Newton's third law of action reaction is that it makes it seem like it's a movement law. It's a force law. You can have Newton's third law and there's no motion at all. Just the word action makes it seem like you're in a movie set and action, move. But you can have Newton's third law without having any motion at all. I have Newton's third law right here and I'm trying not to move. The force that the ground feels is the force I feel. So when you have verbiage in previous textbooks and online resources that say muscle action, like the biceps muscle action, it associates this muscle does this specific motion. Does that make sense? So watch. This is pulled from a resource just to show you what I'm trying to get at. The biceps brachii, origin, right? On top of the coracoid process. I love these random words. Tip of coracoid process of scapula. Right? That's the socket. It's on top of the socket. Okay, so it crosses the shoulder. The long head. Oh, I love this one even better. Supraglenoid tubercle of scapula. What's the capital of Texas? Here's the main thing. Action. Action. What does it do? And these words like action implants in our head that I have to see motion for that muscle to be doing a job. What if I'm just holding two dumbbells like this and there's no motion? Wouldn't my bicep be tired? It's still doing a job. Isometrically, it's preventing my elbow from extending. But I would never know that if all I did was memorize that the action of this muscle is flexion. Or what if I'm doing curls and I lower it down? Wouldn't that be extension? In 310, and it's not their fault. In 310, when I'm asking 310 questions, tons of times people will tell me bicep, tricep, same curl, bicep, tricep. Students will tell me quads at the knees. No, they'll say hamstrings at the knees as I flex and quads at the knees when I come up. But it's the same muscles. But they are so used to memorizing motion and muscles because of this horrible verbiage that they want to say, well, the knees are flexing and the hamstrings flex the knees. And they don't understand the context of the contractions. Does that make sense? So all I'm saying is that if you have old resources, I'm going to give you my resources. But if you have old resources, I'm just making you mindful that I have no problem with origins and insertions and innervation. That's geography. I do have a problem with this term that's called action, and it'll give specific motions without context of contractions. So in other words, I have no problem with this if they say, when working concentrically, flexes the elbow and supinates the radial ulnar joint. No problem, but zero context. So it makes us want to just memorize. When I see this motion, it has to be because of that muscle. And a majority of time, guys, there's 3 contraction options. Concentric is only going to happen a third of the time. You're going to bet 33. You're going to bet 1 out of every 3 times that that muscle actually does that motion. The odds are not in our favor. Think about it. When you're doing an exercise, you're going to be doing the opposite motion half of the time. Because you got to do eccentric in order to be able to bring it back up concentric in the case of the curls, right? So watch how we're going to talk about muscles. Function. We're not going to use the term action because action infers motion. We're going to use purpose. We're going to use function. That bicep doesn't do flexion all the time. That bicep is responsible for flexion a third of the time. But what does the bicep do all of the time? It pulls a certain way. It pulls, because muscles can only pull. Thank you, 310. Muscles can only pull. And muscles pull in specific directions of motion. But that doesn't mean they're always going to cause that specific motion. Direction of pull. In 310, I use the elevator analogy. Why is an elevator called an elevator? And you can say, well, because it brings you up. Cool, how are you going to get down? It's got to bring you down too. But the elevator influences your motion in both directions by pulling in the exact same way. You don't have a cable that yanks you down. You have a cable that pulls up, that will bring you up. Work by allowing you not to fall down and then let you down while still pulling up. The function was the same. That cable is pulling up the entire time, regardless of the motion it's responsible for. The different motions would be the context of the different contractions. Concentric, it would make you come up. Isometric, it would keep you up. And eccentric, it would lower you down. So the motions are different, the contractions are different, but the direction of pull is the same. Does that make sense? So for our classes, all of the different muscles that we're going to look at, it's all about the direction of their pull. How do they pull? Is the right sternocleidomastoid pulling your neck forward? Is it pulling to the right? And is it pulling across? It's how do the muscles pull? Once we can see the pull, then we can use contraction as a function of motion. Concentrically, it's going to look like this. Eccentrically, it's going to look like that. Isometrically, it's going to look like this. But we have to have all 3 parts, guys. That's like trying to play a card game and you don't have all 52 cards. You can't for most games. Blackjack, stop it. We have to have all 3. Muscles, specific muscles. I'm going to teach you some really cool muscles. Tibialis posterior, extensor hallucis longus, brachialis, subscapularis. Doesn't matter. How they pull. What direction of motion do these muscles pull is the most important part of this class. Okay? Then we're going to do a lot of practice. We're going to do a lot of lab work where we do scenarios so that you can see that if my hand is trying to push my left ear to my left shoulder, I need muscles that are pulling right ear, right shoulder. Who pulls that way? And I'm going to teach you how to see those muscles. But what I can't say is, what muscles am I using in this isometric, no movement situation? And you're like, well, let me go through all my muscles. Oh no, all the muscles that I memorized had a motion associated with it, and I can't see these isometric examples. Are we starting to see the problem? This is the solution. Okay, so let's roll. Consider the following. Biceps brachii influences elbow flexion from left to right. True, the dumbbell's trying to extend the elbows. True, so I need elbow flexion pullers. We call them elbow flexors. True, biceps brachii is the most popular, the most famous. It's the most famous elbow flexion puller in the world. But watch the point. From left to right, when I have flexion, the biceps brachii does this through concentric contraction. But when I go from right to left and I have extension, it's still the same muscle, but we're going to have different motion because of different contraction. So one of my biggest problems that I have with students, not your fault, is understanding why this isn't tricep, because you're like, well, there's extension. There's extension. And look, in this book or in my notes, it said tricep does extension. Are we starting to see the issue? All right. So in 310, we did several. That was our whole last test. We try to see which force, effort, as we called it in Leaders, which force we need to pull at a joint because we see why we need to pull at that joint. The dumbbell's trying to extend me. If I'm doing an exercise slow and controlled, I don't need extension pullers. I need flexion pullers. I need muscles that are pulling, creating moment, creating torque in the direction of elbow flexion. Who are those muscles? In 310, I said, don't worry about it. You just need to understand that I need muscles that pull this way if something's trying to take me that way. In this class, we will care about it. In this class, we're going to look at the different elbow flexion pullers. We're going to teach you about the brachioradialis. I'm going to teach you about the brachialis and the biceps brachii, the most popular one of all. Okay? But no skeletal muscle works by itself. They're all going to have help. The only muscle that works by itself is the heart. That's not a skeletal muscle. What about the diaphragm? Stop. That's not a skeletal muscle either. So here's another one. Biceps brachii holds each position in the photos. Does that make sense? Like, it's working above resting tone. It's doing a job preventing extension, but there's no motion there. I'd have students tell me there's nothing working because they don't see a motion. They're going through all of their slides. And they're like, there's no muscles because there's no motion. Does that make sense? Okay, I did one that has the same movements, but different muscles to show what we're talking about. So in other words, here we had flexion. Here we had flexion. But here we had bicep, and here we had tricep. So again, that's why we can't say, when I see flexion, it's because of this muscle. I'm giving you examples of why we can't do that. We're good? All right. So question number one, why do so many resources state that the action of a specific muscle is a specific motion? And the real answer is because it's convenient to teach and easy to memorize. Because that's what our bodies want to hold on to. I was the same way. We want to be able to say, this does that, this does this, that does this does that. Capital of Texas is awesome under all circumstances. But the problem is, there's a third variable that we have that it's not as clean as this muscle does this motion. There's this third variable that gets left out, and that's contraction. Context of contraction has to be in the conversation, guys. I love this quote from Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. All right, guys, precedent. What do we know about work? Force and distance, right? From our first exam. All right, so check this out. I'm going to walk you down the path of understanding. This is actually a 310 review, but I put it in different verbiage. So what's the work equation? Force and distance. From force and distance, force times, we can rearrange the variables. So in other words, work is force times distance. Well, let's just flip it around and say force times distance is equal to work. Not rocket science. Well, we're going to look at specific forces, internal muscle forces. Muscle forces, and we're going to look at specific distances, joint motions. Muscle force and joint motion is related to muscle work. Agonistic muscle groups, muscles doing a job in joint motion, is related to muscle contraction. That's why in 310 I always say contraction is like work. Work is like contraction, because they are. See where I'm going with this? So we can shorten that up. Agonist and joint motion is related to contraction. And then in 310, I tried to make a simple little kind of relationship, A and B and C. A for agonist. B for body joint motion, because I had to get a B word in there, but it's just joint motion. But A plus J is equal to C, just not as clean as B, okay? But that's it. A plus B is C is the work equation applied to how our muscles influence motion through contraction. Anybody remember that? Okay. Then I doubled down and did it in a different way. If I tell you that muscles influence motion through contraction, muscles, agonists, influence joint motion through contraction, agonists influence motion through contraction, A and B to Z. Like you still get to the same thing. Muscles, motion, contraction. 3 variables. In 310 and in this class, you solve for the agonist. And when I say solve, remember what's the external force trying to do, and then you can see what group of muscles we need in a direction of pull. Gravity's trying to adduct my shoulders. So what group of muscles, if gravity's trying to adduct me, I need abduction pulling muscles, right? Ones that are pulling up. And then guys, in this class, I'm going to teach you how to easily see who are those muscles. Who are the abduction pulling muscles that I need? And when I see abduction, awesome, those abduction pulling muscles, the supraspinatus and the anterior middle and posterior deltoid, they would be working concentrically to make me abduct. They'd be working isometrically to prevent me from adducting, and they would be working eccentrically to allow me to adduct. But notice, I would never say the supraspinatus, which is an abduction pulling muscle, only does abduction. Because I just showed you, I can use that muscle to do adduction. And I can use that muscle to do nothing. Just can't do it. If we want to be correct. Solve for A, who are our agonists. Observe B, what was the motion? And contraction is solved for. We prove contraction. In 310, remember? Elbow flexors are working in this exercise, like the curl, and I observe extension. Flexion pullers or flexors do extension through eccentric contraction. Remember that in 310? That's the work equation. Elbow flexors, when they're working as an agonist, do flexion through concentric.
What group do I need in this exercise? Do I need flexion pullers or extension pullers? Extension pullers, yeah, because I can see that that dumbbell wants to flex me. So the extensors are my agonists, because I proved it. I observe flexion. Well, the only way the extensors can do flexion is through eccentric contraction. Remember that? If I observe extension in this exercise, I'm still using my extensors because the dumbbell is still trying to flex me. Extensors do extension through concentric contraction. Guys, the only added part of this class is, who are those extensors? And I'm going to teach you not just about the tricep and how it crosses and how it works. I'm going to teach you about the anconeus. I'm going to teach you about other muscles that are in those groups. That's it. External force trying to do what to my elbows? Flex me or extend me? Yeah, so I need flexion pullers, right? Think of it as identifying the agonist is like identifying the internal, because that's where negative actually comes from, is that when you're working an agonist, that is the positive. That is the one you're turning on. That is the light switch of those muscles you're turning on. So when those muscles are pulling in a specific direction of pull, but yet allowing motion in the opposite direction, that's where you get the negative work. It's like I take the book off of the ground and I'm pulling up, but I let it go down. That's where it comes from. That's where negative comes from. We figure out agonists, taught you how to do that. We observe motion, I taught you how to do that. We solve for contraction, I taught you how to do that. The only thing we're going to do over the next few weeks is look at specific muscles in the agonistic group. Right lateral cervical benders, left lateral cervical benders, cervical flexors, cervical extensors, right transverse cervical rotators, left transverse cervical rotators. Who are those muscles? And I'm going to teach you how to see them on how they pull. I'm going to teach you how a right sternocleidomastoid is trying to make you look left. And I'm going to teach you how a left sternocleidomastoid is trying to make you look right. I'm going to teach you those things. But all of that is null and void if we can't understand why we're classifying muscles based on how they pull and not on a specific motion that we observe. That's why I'm on this speech for so long. Because I'm trying to rewire your brain, because that's how imprinted this muscle does this motion is. Okay, this is, I put this twice. So these are some examples. Oh no, it's the example that I gave you, but just put into the verbiage that we're using. I also added it in a landscape slide. That's the supplement, so that if you wanted to pull it up, it would be easier. If I were to edit this one, it would want me to edit everything. I couldn't just edit this one slide in my caveman-like understanding of technology, okay? But look what this does. It goes through our process, all right? EF, elbow extension puller, IF, elbow flexion puller, agonist, elbow flexion. So EF is external force. So the external force of gravity is pulling in the direction of elbow extension, true? So wouldn't it make sense that I need my elbow flexion pullers to do this exercise to go against gravity, right? So that means I know that my agonist has to be my elbow flexors, because I can see what would happen if I turned them off. If I turned off those muscles, extension would happen. So I solve my agonist, and then I observe motion. Muscles in the group. So biceps brachii, brachialis, brachioradialis. Now that's an example. Guys, I'm going to teach you this. I don't expect you to know these right now. I'm going to teach them to you. And I'm going to teach you how to see them. And I'm going to teach you simple ways to remember them. That's part of the fun. But what this slide helps us to remind ourselves is that when we identify a group, It's all of the muscles that pull in that direction. Think of it like this. Think about how hard it would be. And I did this in 310. But like if you're talking about someone doing an exercise and there's a bunch of muscles, like we have 7 major knee flexors, knee flexion pulls. So it's like, hey, can I get in there and do hamstring curls? That's a lot more convenient than can I get in there and do semimembranosus, semitendinosus, biceps femoris, gastrocnemius, sartorius, gracilis, popliteus curl, right? Like listing all the muscles doesn't sound very practical. But if all we do is mention bicep all the time, then it makes us forget about the other muscles that are just as important. In fact, the brachialis underneath it is even more powerful than the biceps brachialis. But we never talk about it. Because all we do is do the bicep. It's like moving cocoa. It's like if you never talk about it, it has a second death. So to make things easier for us, we don't have to sit here and list all the muscles. But that's why we talk about them in their direction of pull. My elbow flexion pullers includes all the different muscles. My knee flexion pullers includes all those muscles. My external rotation hip muscles, those pullers, encompass gluteus maximus. It encompasses piriformis. It encompasses obturator internus, externus, quadratus femoris, gemellus superior, gemellus inferior. It's everything that pulls the hip in a lateral direction. So it's identifying the group first, which is 310, and then saying who's in that group. Who are the ones that pull that way? Process. What is the external force trying to do? That helps me identify my agonist. Once I have my agonistic group, then I can say, who's in that group? Who's on that team? Guys, we use teams all the time. The Pelicans are a team. I don't have to have all the players memorized. They're individual players on that team, but they are a team. All these agonistic groups are a team. We have as many agonists as we have joint motions. We have dorsiflexion pullers and plantar flexion pullers and knee flexion pullers and knee extension pullers. They're on a team. Who are the players on the team? My knee extension pullers? Yeah, I got some stars. Vastus medialis and lateralis and intermedius and rectus femoris. But they're a team. They all have something in common. They pull in a specific direction. All right. So we're going to start on cervical and 2 things that require a muscle to join a team. For a muscle to function at a joint, for a muscle to have influence on my elbow, it's got to cross my elbow. It's got to get into my elbow. Think of it like this. If I had a string, if I was a puppet and I had a string and that string didn't go down into my arm, I couldn't move my arm. If the string crosses my shoulder, I could pull my shoulder forward. If the string crosses my elbow, I can pull my elbow forward. If the string crosses my wrist, I could pull my wrist forward. If the string crosses my finger, I could pull my finger forward. If I had a muscle that went from my collarbone to the tip of my middle finger, and I pulled it, you would see this, followed by this, followed by this, followed by that. For a muscle to have a function at a joint, it's got to cross into that joint. It's got to go into that land. And then the specific function is how. How does it cross? Think about it. If this string analogy, the only reason it did finger flexion, wrist flexion, elbow flexion, and shoulder flexion was because it crossed all those joints anteriorly or in the front. But if that same string would have crossed the back, it would have done finger extension, wrist extension, elbow extension, shoulder extension. A muscle that crossed the wrist on the medial side is going to pull this way. But a muscle that crossed the wrist on the lateral side is going to pull that way. A muscle that crosses my neck on my right side is going to pull right ear, right shoulder. But a muscle that crosses my leg on the left side is going to pull left ear, right shoulder. Does it? How does it? I'm going to teach you these things. I'm going to teach you these things using this old friend of ours called planes and axes. Guys, everything in your body is somewhat circular. Mine might be a little bit more circular, but everything. My finger is somewhat circular, my wrist is somewhat circular, my elbow is somewhat circular, my shoulder is somewhat circular, my neck is somewhat circular, my hip, my knee, my ankle. So it's called a cross section. And what we're going to look at, we're going to see how every joint, so let's say my wrist, if I'm looking at a cross section of my wrist, the wrist moves about its bilateral axis, right? Flexion, extension. And it moves about its AP axis, radial non-deviation. So I'm going to teach you how to see how muscles pull in different directions based on how they cross these axes. That's moment, that's torque. In other words, here's your neck, there's your neck. Realistically, it would be here, but I can't show you a slide like this, so I have to rotate it like that. And so it'd be like I'd be laying down. Now, it works if you have your computer or laptop flat, but if you have it elevated, this is what you're seeing. And that red axis is your bilateral. And muscles that cross the neck in the front are going to be flexion pullers. And muscles that cross that neck in the back are going to be extension pullers. The blue axis, your AP axis, the muscles that cross on the right side are going to be right lateral cervical benders, left lateral cervical benders. Then we get to go outside and play on the merry-go-round, and we get to look at the polar axis, and you're going to see muscles that try to spin the merry-go-round this way as right transverse pullers and left transverse pullers. We're going to put muscles into all these different cross-sectional circles, not to make you see motion, but to see pull. Guys, this analogy didn't come from me. This analogy came from Dr. George, who's currently battling brain cancer. He was the biomechanics professor from the 70s until he retired in 2006, and I took his job. You've been having a similar approach to teaching kinesiology at this university since the 70s. His analogy, which I love, he said if you were asked to name as many classmates as you could from any class you had, kindergarten, first grade, junior high, you wouldn't rattle off a list. It'd be easier for you to say who sat in the front of me, who sat behind me, who sat on the right side of the class, who sat on the left side. Heck, we could do that right now. Who's on the right side, who's on the left side? Our brains do well with spatial relationships. And that's all we're going to do with this. Every joint in the body is a classroom. Some classes are small, like my little hometown. Not a lot of people. Some classes are big. Hip, shoulder, big 5A class. But I'm going to teach you how spatial relationship works. Who are the muscles in the front? They're going to pull this way. Who are the muscles that cross in the back? They're going to pull that way. Who are the ones on the right side? Who are the ones on the left side? And then we're going to get out of the classroom for the transverse plane and go play PE. Who's trying to spin the merry-go-round this way? Who's trying to spin the merry-go-round that way? For the hip, who sits in the front of the class? That's going to pull the hip in a direction that's going to be a hip flexion pull. And the posterior crossing muscles are going to be hip extension pullers. And the lateral crossing muscles are going to be abduction pullers. And the medial crossing muscles are going to be adduction pullers. Then we go outside and play in a merry-go-round, the external rotation pullers and the internal rotation. The cross-sectional approach to anatomy understanding doesn't tell you contraction. Routine told you contraction. This doesn't tell you if a muscle's working, but once you identify the agonists, once you understand who's working, this helps to remind you of all the different members of that team. This approach will help you remember who's on the right side, who's on the left side, who's in the back, who's in the front. This will help you to remember, oh, I'm doing an ankle exercise and the TheraBand's trying to plantar flex me. I need dorsiflexors. Now that I know I need dorsiflexors, let me remember who sits in that class. Tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis longus, extensor digitorum longus, peroneus tertius, bang, 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 because you can see them. Why understanding how muscles pull is also important for stretching. If I want to stretch hip extensor pulling muscles, don't I want to flex the hips? We did that in 310 as well. Right? So what muscles am I stretching when I plantar flex or invert or abduct or externally rotate? It'll help you to see those muscles. All right, last bit of news. First of all, any questions? I feel like I'm campaigning. I am on campaigning for knowledge. We are getting, did I mention that we're getting booted out of this classroom? All right, then y'all out here. I'm going to send a follow-up. What's that? I'm going to send up a follow-up email. I want you to eventually, in the next couple weeks before Easter, confirm with me your skill, just so we're making sure we're on the same page. You know what I'm trying to prevent? You doing more than what you have to. I'm trying to prevent you doing more than what you have.
You can go. I just got a quick question.
Yeah, what you got?
Will you post the skills analysis project, like Word document that you showed us?